Hello everyone, I'm Daniel Steele, and I'm coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. In this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about deontology and public health, and this lecture will cover the Dean reading from week 3 of the syllabus. So first off, what is deontology? Like consequentialism, deontology is a kind of umbrella term that covers a number of different ethical theories. But their common feature is that they all claim that some actions are just inherently right or wrong, no matter their consequences. Now, you might actually have this kind of intuition that there's some things that are just right or wrong. If, for example, you're interested in the idea of human rights. So for instance, if you think that torture is just wrong, it's a violation of human rights, and even if you could produce some benefit overall by torturing someone. Let's say you gain some information that could help save a bunch of other people and the number of lives saved would sort of outweigh the harm of the torture that was done. Even if that was the case, you might think torture is just wrong and you shouldn't do it. So if you have that kind of intuition, then you might be someone who's inclined to deontology. So if we think about this in comparison to utilitarianism, in utilitarianism, of course, consequences alone are what matters. If you're trying to decide the right action, you add up the pros and the cons, and you pick the action that produces overall the most well-being for everyone affected. But deontology insists that consequences aren't the only thing that matters. So what else could matter? One of the things that can matter is the reasons and the sort of rationale behind the action. So if you imagine someone doing something that has good consequences, but for bad motives, like let's say Dr. Katz here makes a large donation to Médecins Sans Frontières, but she just does this to gain standing with her peers, to improve her reputation, and to get a tax deduction, and in fact doesn't really care about humanitarianism at all, then even if this donation had good effects from a deontological standpoint, it might be viewed as not a very good action, even though from a utilitarian standpoint, it would be very praiseworthy. So one challenge, though, for deontology is to provide reasons for understanding when, or rules for understanding when you should be doing something and when not. That is to say, if you think of consequentialism or utilitarianism, for any flaws it may have, at least it has a fairly straightforward way of understanding if two people had different views about what was right or what was wrong. They could try to resolve that disagreement by going and getting more data about what are the effects of the actions, and how much harm and how much good are done by the different options that could be chosen. And maybe with more data, you could get some way of answering the question and resolving the disagreement. However, if two people just have really different convictions or strong intuitions about this thing is just wrong, and another person thinks, no, that thing isn't just wrong, and this other thing is wrong, then how do you in a deontological way decide try to resolve that dispute or disagreement in a rational way? So Immanuel Kant, who is sort of the most famous deontologist in sort of the history of Western philosophy, came up with a few criterion, a few general rules that he thought could help one decide from a deontological standpoint what was the right thing to do in any situation. And so these two rules are commonly called the categorical imperative forms 1 and 2, and they go like this. The first form says, act only on the maxim that you can will become a universal law. Now that might sound confusing, but the idea is that a maxim is sort of a rule, like a little rule of thumb that you could follow in a situation. And the idea is if you're going to say what I'm doing is okay, then you basically are implying that anybody else could act in the same situation and follow the same rule I'm acting and apply that rule in other situations where it might be relevant, and that would be something I would be willing to go along with. The second form of the categorical imperative says, always treat persons, including yourself, only as ends in themselves and never as mere means. And here the idea is that when you're acting in a way that affects other people, you should always think of the humanity of that other person. Think of that person as a human being in their own right who has their own interests, their own desires, their own ability to think and reason for themselves about what's good for them. And you should never just use them as a sort of object to promote your own ends or interests. So let's consider two examples about how these two categorical imperative forms could work. So let's first return to the example we discussed last week about the doctors who euthanized Joe to harvest his organs in order to save 5 other people who they regard as sort of more deserving. So in this case, Dr. Katz's maxim might be something like, it's permissible to sacrifice the life of an undeserving person to save those who are more deserving. Now, if we think of this example in terms of the 2 categorical imperatives, it's pretty clear that the second form, that you should never use a person as a mere means, is being violated in this case. Joe is just being used as an object to increase the well-being of other people. And so according to the second maxim, that's clearly going to be wrong. Or the second categorical imperative, that's clearly wrong. And you could get a similar result from the first one. If you think of, well, could Dr. Katz or could anybody will that this rule, sacrifice a life of an undeserving person to save the lives who are more deserving, could this be a rule that you could will just be followed in every case? And the idea is that, well, it would be really difficult to want that to be a universal rule, because imagine that you were in the situation of Joe. You were the one who is at the hospital, and the doctor thinks that you are less deserving than other people and wants to euthanize you and take your organs. Well, clearly you wouldn't want that. And so the idea is that when you think about, well, would I be willing to have this a rule that would always apply, even if the roles were reversed? And then if you're not okay with that, then you should think, this isn't a good idea. This isn't a good thing to do. In the second example, Dr. Katz is considering lying about money she receives from Purdue Pharma Canada Inc. on a conflict of interest disclosure form. And Dr. Katz tells herself, well, no one will ever know, so why not? What's the big deal? So in this example, Dr. Katz's maxim might be lie if you think you won't get caught. And so here, again, if you think, will that this be a universal law? Well, that's again going to be difficult to do. Dr. Katz probably doesn't want other people to lie to her. Moreover, if you even think about what would a society be like if everybody lied all the time, if everybody lied anytime they thought they could get away with it, and you stop to think about that and think, could that society even function? Because no one would ever trust anything anybody said, because they would always think, they're probably lying. And so in a world where everybody is just always going to lie whenever they think they can get away with it, it's going to be very difficult for society to even work at all, for society to even function. And in fact, it's not even going to make sense to lie, because if everyone lies, nobody trusts anybody, and lying just doesn't even work. And so the whole idea of trying to universalize this rule just seems almost incoherent. And this gets at a really basic and important idea in Kantian philosophy and deontology, and that is the idea that there's some rules that allow for society to function, and there's some rules that are just sort of incompatible with society being able to function. And we can understand what the difference between those types of rules just by sort of thinking about it, by thinking of the logic of it. And that's going to enable us to think about what kinds of rules society should have and shouldn't have. So in addition, of course, if you thought about this from the second form of the categorical imperative here, Dr. Katz could be using other people by lying to them. All right, so let's think then about stigma, which was the main topic of the Dean reading. And of course, Dean approaches stigma in public health from the point of view of deontology. So when you stigmatize someone, your aim is not merely to respond to a trait that you find undesirable, but to encourage the idea, even in that person themselves, that this is just an awful thing and they should feel bad about it and therefore change what they're doing. And this is from a definition from Andrew Courtwright. Here you can link to that if you would like. And it's possible to find examples of stigmatization used in public health campaigns. And this image over here on the slide illustrates such a campaign. This is from a campaign called Live Lighter from Australia. And this campaign used videos and images like this that are pretty clearly stigmatizing to try to encourage people who were overweight to eat healthier, to exercise more, and so on, with the idea that this would reduce obesity. So one question then, is this ever justifiable? Should stigmatization ever be something that could be a legitimate, okay thing to do in public health? If we approach that question from utilitarianism, from that perspective, what we would need to think about is, well, what are the consequences? And here we can think about two general types of consequences that stigma can have. One, and the most immediate, is that it has negative consequences on those who are stigmatized. It causes stress, it causes self-loathing, and these are obviously not good for well-being. So that's an immediate sort of negative from a utilitarian standpoint. But from a utilitarian standpoint, stigma can also sometimes have a positive effect of discouraging behaviors that harm health, like smoking or maybe driving while intoxicated. And so from a utilitarian standpoint, whether stigmatization in public health is acceptable or not is going to depend on the balance of these two things, the harm to those who are stigmatized versus the benefit in terms of reducing how frequently people behave in this way that's harmful and how much benefit you get from that. In the case of obesity and stigmatization, there's some research that suggests that, in fact, stigmatizing obesity is not, in fact, helpful for reducing obesity rates. And so from a utilitarian standpoint, this wouldn't be a good thing. The Dean article points out that HIV is a similar case where stigmatization doesn't appear to be very effective, but Dean suggests maybe in the case of smoking, stigma actually is effective. So that leads to the question of deontology. Would deontology ever regard stigmatization as something that's okay? And there the answer is basically no. And this is something we can discuss in class, but I encourage you to sort of pause and think through the categorical imperative and think in its two forms and think about why stigmatization would not be justifiable according to either of those. And Dean also argues that stigmatization is bad even viewed from the people who are not stigmatized, because it encourages people who are not stigmatized to be complacent and feel superior to other people and not think about ways that they could improve themselves. So the key idea here is that from a deontological perspective, you don't need to wait for the data. You just can reason and think through it and see that stigmatization is clearly wrong and you shouldn't do it. Now, one of the things that that Dean is focused on in his paper is denormalization. And that's denormalization, attempts to make certain behaviors less common by sort of changing the norms around those behaviors so that those behaviors are no longer seen as normal, so that things like smoking or driving while intoxicated are not seen as like normal, okay things to do. And Dean basically suggests that stigmatization and denormalization are sort of linked. So that if you denormalize something, then you stigmatize something. And that's something we'll think about in class. I mean, is it possible to denormalize, say, smoking or drunk driving without stigmatizing those things? Is it possible to denormalize something, to change the norms around it so it's no longer seen as an okay or normal thing without stigmatizing people who do that thing? And if the answer to that question happened to be no, then it would actually follow that stigmatization could not be totally avoided. If the only way to, say, make smoking less common, any measure that did that was going to stigmatize smoking in some way or other, then it would seem like it's impossible to avoid stigmatization completely in public health. And this is actually something that Dean sort of suggests at some point in the reading here, including in this passage that's on the slide, when he considers the effects of bans on smoking in public spaces. He thinks, well, this might indirectly stigmatize people, by segregating smokers from everybody else, even if the intention is really just to protect people who from secondhand smoke. So this leads to some questions that we'll take up in class. Is it possible to completely avoid stigmatization in public health? And if it isn't, then what does that mean for arguments that stigmatization is just wrong, always wrong, and absolutely should never be done in any way, shape, or form? Okay, so that's it for this lecture, and I will see you in class soon. Bye-bye.